Last week, we talked about logic, ethos, and pathos. And I left you on a little bit of a cliffhanger because I wanted to talk more about the ways in which logic can break down. Now, I think last week we also talked about the fact that not everybody works with a system of logic, right? Logic is not as persuasive to a lot of people as I personally would like to think that it is. It's just not. And in fact, the problems with logic don't just end there. Logic itself has some very interesting issues with it that when you see them, you can use logical thinking to kind of mess with people. And in fact, there are holes in logic that people fall for all the time. These holes in logic, flaws in logic, are called fallacies. And understanding how a logical fallacy works makes it a lot easier for you to resist when someone's trying to deceive you. Because a lot of times, deception is rooted within logical fallacies. So, I'm not going to go through all the logical fallacies. I might include a link with the list of them just because I think they're a really interesting thing to understand and know about. But let's talk about 3 of them today. And we'll also talk about essay 4 today. So you'll have a really good idea of what the next thing I want from you is. Now, one of the most obvious logical fallacies is called a straw man. Now, if you are interested in politics in any way, you're going to recognize this one. Straw men are almost always fallacious. They are incorrect forms of argumentation. And yet, most people, when they encounter a straw man, never stop to really think about what they're being told. Most politicians use straw men all the time. Now, a straw man is when you build up an argument. And it's basically a really complicated way of saying, putting words in someone's mouth. You make an argument on behalf of someone else, and then you light that straw man on fire. There are a lot of interesting examples of straw men throughout the political spectrum. I'm going to try to go both sides because I like to try to play the middle on this type of thing. But from the liberal side, straw men that I've seen over and over again, liberals, when Republicans want to do things like cut social programs, when they want to roll back spending on a government basis, one of the immediate things that liberals will often say is that Republicans want to kill grandma by cutting things like medical aid and all sorts of social programs, right? Now, I guess you could argue that cutting these programs could technically put people who are reliant upon them in danger. But they're not saying they want to kill grandma, right? They're not saying that they want to endanger kids. So when Democrats come and use that kind of incendiary language, that is a bit of a straw man, right? Republicans don't actually want to do that. They're arguing something different. It's a matter of fiscal policy. They're not literally coming after grandma, right? That's a straw man. I think my favorite specific example of this comes from the right, because this was such an effective technique, though. As I talk about these logical fallacies, keep in mind that they are still very effective sometimes. The straw man that I think was the most effective I've ever seen in my years of following politics had to do with the death panels. When Obamacare was being proposed, the Affordable Care Act, I kept seeing this stuff about there will be death panels. Now, the idea of the death panel is that you would have a government body that would decide when your health would be not worth investing in. That they would decide when to cut off your funding. And so you had this cry of there will be death panels, there will be death panels. The reason that this is a straw man is because there was absolutely no language in the law itself that put together that type of governing body. There were no death panels. Now, keep in mind also something that's really interesting. And when I say stuff like this can be really incendiary, but just hear me out. We kind of already have death panels in this country. Now, when I say this, I'm not criticizing this because I understand the importance of it. When I say a death panel, a group of people who decide when someone lives and when someone dies, that's an insurance company. An insurance company is a corporation whose first priority is to make money. And so they do have to make decisions upon who gets the care and who doesn't. Where is it financially viable to provide care and when is it not? Those are very difficult decisions to make, right? And they have to make them. I'm not putting them on blast. That is a understandable part of the business. It sucks, but that's just kind of one of the things that we have to have in our system. Death panels exist. We have it within the insurance companies. Now, the thing that bugs me about this straw man is that A, we already have a system that's a lot like that, and B, it was nowhere in the law when they made this thing up and then they attacked the made up position rather than what was actually in the substance of the law itself. That being said, I throw this back to you. Despite the fact that this is technically a logical fallacy, it worked. And a lot of people still have very negative opinions of the Affordable Care Act because of this perceived presence of death panels. Now, this leads me to another one that I find really interesting, and that's the slippery slope. This one is the one that irritates me the most because I think this one might actually be the most common. A slippery slope is basically when you put together an argument that says, well, if we do this, then this will happen. Then this will happen. Then this will happen. The thing about a slippery slope is that the further you go down the slope, the more extreme the situation gets, right? So one of the ways that they kind of fortified their position on the death panel thing was they backpedaled and said, well, even if the death panels aren't in the law, we'll eventually have those. This is ridiculous because we already have those. But if you ever hear a slippery slope argument, you know it's getting increasingly more ridiculous because it has to make more and more assumptions the further you go down the slope. Now, I could potentially light myself on fire with this next example, but this is one of my favorite examples of a slippery slope, and it has to do with the debate around same-sex marriage. Now, follow with me for a minute. I hear this argument even today, and it drives me crazy. If we allow for same-sex marriage, that is in and of itself a violation of the sanctity of marriage. And at that point, we have redefined marriage in a way that will lead to increasingly more extreme interpretations of what marriage is. Now, I'm kind of on board so far, especially since marriage as a definition is itself an extremely complicated concept, right? Some people have more of a legalistic definition of marriage, while some people see marriage as a sanctimonious thing that is religious. And that's where a lot of this anxiety comes from in the redefinition of marriage. So where it starts to get problematic is when you start looking at how the slippery slope operates. The slippery slope on the redefinition of marriage, its next logical step is usually this. And I imagine a lot of you guys have probably heard this argument before. It's a very common one. If we allow for same-sex marriage, who's to say we do not allow for polygamy? Now, this is what makes this argument so deceptive. Already, that's not necessarily the most extreme example, and it's very convincing. We haven't really messed with logic that much yet, because there are people who use that logic to try to push for a polygamous marriage definition. I was talking with a very close friend of mine, and we were talking about polygamy, and I expressed a rather negative sentiment about it. And the friend looked at me and said, "Who the hell are you to tell two grown adults what they can and cannot do with their relationships?" And I was like, that was a very surprising thing for me. So I've encountered people who argue for polygamy, even though they don't necessarily want to participate in it. I'm like, I got one wife, that's enough. Anyway, the amount of spouses has to make the problems go through the roof. Now, so far, we made a step down the slope towards polygamy. And this is so far still kind of rational, because I have heard those arguments. Here's where things start to get extreme. Typically, the argument on its next step introduces us to a major bump. And that next step is marriages with animals. Marriages with animals. So if we allow for same-sex marriage, we will allow for polygamy. And then if we allow for polygamy, we'll allow for marriages with animals. And then to get even further down the slope, if we allow marriages with animals, who's to say we won't allow marriages with small children? Whoa, 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 whoa. We've taken two huge steps. Now, one of the things that's actually kind of concerning to me about the prevalence of this argument is the fact that there's a major line between polygamous marriages, and animal marriages. Do you know what that line is? What separates those two things? Consent. Consent forms a really heavy boundary because animals cannot say yes, right? We can't get that type of interaction with animals. They don't understand what they're getting involved with. So from there, we can apply the same logic to children because children don't understand what type of relationship they're getting involved in, and therefore children can't consent either. So the slippery slope makes a huge dive when you start getting into those last two marriage types. Now, this is not to say that there are not valuable and non-fallacious arguments against same-sex marriage. There are. But this one is extremely problematic the farther you go down the slope. For me, I really do not like slippery slope arguments. But the funny thing is I still find myself convinced by them sometimes. They really get at a sense of rationality within us to think that sounds completely rational. But if you stop and think about any slippery slope argument, you're really having some problems. Right now, I'm trying to think of an argument from the left against the right to kind of balance this out. Maybe. Oh, here's one, because I need to try to make both sides of the political spectrum look equally ridiculous. Gun control and gun rights. Now, a lot of my friends will use this. Like, if we're allowed to own firearms, then what's to say we can't own an assault rifle? What's to say if I'm allowed to own firearms that I can't own a chain gun that would be mounted on a helicopter? Why should I not be allowed to own explosive munitions? Why should I not be allowed to own a nuclear weapon? Now, again, for everybody out there, do you see how ridiculous this is? A lot of people try to justify extreme gun control by going straight to, well, does that mean you can have a nuclear weapon? Like, slow your roll there, Don, right? Slow your roll there, Johnny. We're not discussing proliferation of nuclear weapons to your next door neighbor who hasn't cut his grass in 6 years, okay? There's a little bit more to the discussion than that. That's a fallacious argument that would be in support of gun control. So I like to try to balance it out a little bit. Anyway, ad hominem. Ad hominem is just personal attacks. This one is extremely immature, but fun. It's like, you shouldn't vote for my opponent because he picks his nose and eats his boogers, right? Or, I don't know why you would trust my opponent to be the mayor of the city when he himself hasn't called his mother in 6 months and he hasn't mowed his grass? These are all things that just because somebody has a personal moral failing, it does not actually, have anything to do with the issue at hand, right? You're just attacking someone and trying to discredit their argument because of, some type of weird failing that you see within the person itself. You're not winning the argument that way. So, well, my friend thinks we should have stricter gun control, but are you really going to trust someone who watches pro wrestling? Hey, I watch pro wrestling. Anyway, you get the point with that, Hominem. That's a pretty easy one. Now, this one's going to be the thing that'll really get me the most in trouble. I need to get into the next leg of the assignments because I've been way too philosophical over the past week. Burden of proof. Burden of proof. I love this one just because it's so weird and strange and so difficult to explain. But when you see burden of proof, I think you'll understand why this is an important one. Burden of proof is an absolutely fundamental problem in human logic that can be exploited by anybody to make all sorts of ridiculous claims. And it sounds extremely logical. And it basically says this: you can make any point by reversing the burden of proof, right? Rather than saying, I have to prove something, saying, you can't prove it's not true. If anyone ever says, you can't prove it's not true, they are doing something extremely dishonest and extremely deceptive. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that they themselves are being dishonest, but their mode of argumentation is. And gosh, I could get in so much trouble for this, but I'm going to do it because it's such a great way of illustrating the logic process. So basically, the example that I like to use has to do between the argument of whether there is a God or whether there isn't a God. Now, I'm not going to weigh in on this. This is all just pure philosophical conjecture, right? But anybody who gets into this conversation has to automatically kind of be really, really honest with themselves and say, proving the existence of God beyond a doubt is an extremely difficult thing to do because no one's ever really done it, right? And that's like one of the whole foundations of faith, the reasons that faith is valuable and the reason that faith is something that we admire is not because it's an easy thing to have, but because it's a hard thing to have. So one of the things that happens when people argue about whether God exists or whether God doesn't exist is kind of then retreating from the conversation and flipping the conversation on its head. So just to kind of give you a few arguments to kind of, give you a little bit of the playing field. One of the first arguments that a lot of people have in this conversation is what we call the Watchmaker Argument, and that has to deal with complexity. I read way too much books about this. People will say that, well, look at how complex the world is. Look at how beautiful everything is. Look at how the world is like an intricate, well-balanced place. Of course there's a God. And then some, jerk atheist comes along and is like, complexity itself doesn't suggest anything about origin. It's just, it is what it is. And in fact, if complexity in a system implies a creator, God is infinitely complex. Who created him, right? So then they might say something along the lines of, look at how wonderful things are, how blessed we are. Well, not everybody has that same level of blessing in their life. The blessings that you feel and the beauty that you see is not a shared perspective. They try to argue on the authority of the Bible to prove that God exists. And then that same jerk atheist is like, that's a pure authoritative argument. Unless I believe in the Bible, that means nothing to me. So, and keep in mind the position that the atheist is taking. A lot of times, like an atheistic thinker doesn't necessarily have to say that God does not exist. You're just saying, I'm not convinced, right? I don't really have the authority to say that he doesn't exist because I don't know that. I can say, I'm not convinced. You can always say that in regard to an argument like this. So a lot of times what happens when someone gets frustrated in this type of conversation is they try to flip the structure of the argument and say, you can't prove he doesn't exist. That is where we get into a huge problem because Bertrand Russell, one of my favorite philosophers, once said, there is a teapot orbiting around Saturn. It is filled with unicorns. Now, not exactly. I'm kind of embellishing a bit. There is filled with unicorns. They're all farting rainbows everywhere. So prove it's not there. A sane person would say, of course it's not there. That's ridiculous. But then prove it's not. The sane person gets a telescope. Look, I got a telescope. We can look at Saturn. It's not there. Person say, what if it's invisible? Well, that type of thing doesn't happen, but you haven't proved it. It can't, right? This is the problem with burden of proof. Proving something doesn't happen is an absolute exercise in insanity, because we can only assert positives. We cannot disprove things. We can take the position, I'm not convinced of your position. I'm not convinced of your position. We can't prove something is not, right? That is a huge issue when we do logical discussions, right? You have to be really careful of that, because it is literally like a giant hole in our heads. Now, here's the thing. The reason I'm pointing all this out, because this is like really, believe it or not, high level philosophical stuff. This is philosophical logic, how we make argumentation. A lot of times, instructors throw students into a kind of pool full of sharks, and they say, argue something, but you don't really know the ins and outs of how to argue something. You also don't know all the crazy ways that can go wrong. Fallacious arguments can be used to bolster your argument, because there's a whole audience of people out there who are probably going to be receptive to it anyway. So that's another just big absolute headache that, we can't completely throw these things out, because there's also one other last fallacy, that is the fallacy. This is hilarious too. And I think for those of you out there who might be big religious thinkers, this might make you feel better about the last one. The fallacy says, just because an argument is fallacious doesn't mean what the person is saying is not true. It just means that that particular type of argument can't be used to prove it. So just because you used a fallacious argument that God exists doesn't mean God doesn't exist. He still very well could. You just haven't proved it. And we're still within the field of debate and discussion, right? So you haven't exactly won just because somebody used a fallacious argument. The point could still be true. So I want you guys to experiment with argumentation. And I want you to not be afraid of using fallacies. I want you to play with argument, because argument is a very fun thing to play with. Now, I've actually gone really far in this video. When I start talking about philosophical crap, I get carried away. I just love it so much. But here's what I want you to do. I've armed you with a lot of things to think about as we move into this final research paper, but we still got an essay to write. We got essay 4. It is due Monday. Essay 4 will be due Monday the 20th. That will give us 2 weeks to do a research paper coming off of it. So here's my plan. I want this to be a start to the research paper. I want it to be a beginning draft. I want you to go back to your political question. I want you to pick a stance with that political question. I want you to pick an opinion. And I want you to tell me a story. One of the fallacies is something called anecdotal fallacy. And that means that personal perspective of your personal perspective does not prove anything. So an example of this would be, I want there to be no gun control. No, wait. Let me go from the left this time, because I've been battering the right because I have trouble balancing it. I want gun control because my cousin was killed in a gunfight. Therefore, we need to have gun control. That's not an argument. Just because you had a relative that was involved in gun crime does not mean that that's an effective argument to control guns for everyone. That's just a personal perspective, right? But what I can do is I can tell you the story of my cousin. And I can say, my cousin was a good person. He got valedictorian. He fell on hard times. He had a lot of stuff that was, messing with him in his life. He hung out with the wrong crowd. He got shot. If there were no guns, he would still be alive. For a lot of people, that's still going to be an effective argument. It still would work, right? They would still find it convincing. So I'm going to ask you to commit a fallacy for Essay 4. I want you to tell me, or you can make up one, a story, an anecdotal story that makes an argument about the question that you asked. And I want you to tell me a story. I want you to give me details, and I want you to convince me. And let's put this at 2 pages, maybe page and a half. And I want you to begin by telling me an argumentative story. Feel free to utilize logical fallacies. Feel free to use ethos, pathos, and logos. Go crazy. But I want to see what you can do. This will also be the start of your research paper. So you will build off of this foundation and do something bigger to end the semester out. I am very hungry. I'm going to go get some food.